born and raised in St. Paul. Received his BA in philosophy, College of St. Thomas. Back when it was the College of St. Thomas, right?
It was a long time ago.
University of St. Thomas. His PhD from the University of Notre Dame in 1988. Began teaching business ethics at the University of St. Thomas Department of Management. 2004, his colleagues elected him to be the first chair of the faculty of the College of Business. At about the same time, he accepted a joint appointment in Catholic Studies and the College of Business at the University of St. Thomas. 2009, he completed a 4-year term as the chair of the Department of Catholic Studies. Dr. Kennedy became the founding co-director of the Terence J. Murphy Institute for Catholic Thought, Law, and Public Policy. His research and publications explore issues of professional ethics, especially concerning business, military, and also elements of the economic dimension of Catholic social tradition. I'm not going to go through even a part of the list of his publications. It's extensive, it's online. Please welcome Dr. Robert Kennedy.
Let's leave that for a minute. When should we quit for questions?
Why don't we quit? What time are we starting?
About 20 to 7.
Quarter after.
Yeah.
20 after the latest.
Okay, that's good. Thank you, Joe. Can you hear me all right? I've got a microphone we can use if. Is that better? Is this better? Okay. Well, Joe, thank you for inviting me. Thanks for the introduction. You prayed reasonably well, I thought. I did notice, though, that you didn't, in that long litany of saints, you didn't mention anything about St. Joseph. Yesterday was his feast day this year, and so on. Of course, do remember that in the New Testament, he has no speaking lines whatsoever. So maybe the silence is appropriate. He did put me in mind, though, of an experience we had with one of our children. We have a large family. They're all grown now. One of our daughters was particularly contrary. And one night we sat down for dinner, and she didn't like what my wife had prepared at all. And she was complaining about it. My wife finally said, well, look, we'll just pray and maybe it'll get better. So we did. And Sheila stopped and looked at it after we finished praying, and she said, Mom, it didn't get any better. She now has 2 children of her own and a daughter who is just as contrary as she was. We're enjoying that immensely. Well, tonight we're talking about the option for the poor. You have a handout. Just summarizes some things, and I put a lot into the handout, really, just so you have some references and so on if you want to pursue some of this a little further. Of the themes that you've chosen to structure the series this year, I think that the theme of the option for the poor is the most ambiguous and the most controversial. So I'm going to give you a little bit of history behind that in a moment, and tell you what I think is sort of the development or the end point for the way in which the church understands this. But first, I do want to point out to you that concern for the poor is a very old part of the tradition. Certainly, it's embedded deep in the Old Testament. It's part of the New Testament. We could spend the whole evening talking about various ways in which this appears in the books of the Old Testament, the prophets, the Gospel, the letters of Paul, and so on and so on. But I'm just going to mention a few things to you as background. One of the things that we notice among the older parts of the Old Testament is a concern for the stranger, the widow, and the orphan. And this becomes a formula that's repeated again and again in the book of Deuteronomy and other books. The stranger, the widow, and the orphan. it becomes for the people of Israel a sign of their fidelity to the covenant. How well the stranger, the widow, and the orphan are treated is a sign of their fidelity to the covenant. And they're reminded by Yahweh again and again, I brought you out of Egypt. I gave you this land. The stranger, the widow, and the orphan are my special concern. You need to take care of them. And if you're not taking care of them, it's a sign that you are not being faithful to the covenant. Does that make sense? Okay. Later, in other books, later in the book, in the Bible anyway, we see not the stranger, the widow, and the orphan, but the anawim in Hebrew, the poor. All of these, the anawim, the stranger, the widow, and the orphan, are designations of people in the community who are vulnerable, who are at risk, who not only need the help of others, but are vulnerable to being treated badly by others. And Yahweh has a special concern for these people. When we get to the New Testament, we see a number of incidents with Jesus. Probably the best known is Matthew 25, where he talks about those who have visited the prisoner, those who have helped others who are vulnerable, and says, whenever you've done that for them, you've done it for me. And of course, the disciples said, well, we haven't done that for you. What we take away from that passage is, in a sense, these people are Christ in disguise. This happened to be a theme of Mother Teresa's, that the sick, the dying are Christ in a horrible disguise, and in serving them, we serve Christ. In Acts of the Apostles, we hear about the early community in Jerusalem, the Christian community in Jerusalem. The apostles in Acts chapter 6 appoint 7 servers to care for some of the people in the Christian community, the early Christian community. Now, what doesn't always come through in the English translation is the Greek word for these servers, ordinary Greek word for server, is diakonoi, deacon. And so we see that as the appointment of the first deacons. And the ones who are appointed all have Greek names, which suggests to us that there were Jewish or Hebrew members of this early community, but there were also Greek members, or at least Jews who came from the Greek portion of the ancient world. And these were probably neglected. So what the apostles did was appoint 7 men who would be particular ministers, servers, diakonoi, to the Greek-speaking community in Jerusalem. Again, the vulnerable, the neglected, and so on. Another theme that we see in the Old Testament, and it obliquely has to do with poverty, is the distinction the Old Testament makes between the rich man and the just man. And you might think the distinction would be the rich man and the poor man, but it's not. It's the rich man and the just man. The rich man in the Old Testament is the one who gains his riches by exploitation, by cheating, by stealing, and so on and so on. It's the just man who may become prosperous, but he becomes prosperous as a result of his hard work and his fairness. And the prosperity that he brings is really prosperity for the community, not just for himself alone. In fact, there's a passage, and I forget now if it's in the Psalms or Proverbs, where the gospel or the scripture says, Yahweh gives to the just in his sleep, gives to the just in his sleep. In other words, by behaving justly, he prospers, and it's not because he's working particularly hard to accumulate wealth. He's trying to be a good man, and the reward is prosperity for himself and the community. So tuck that away. In the early church, there are a number of the fathers of the church who speak to this sort of issue, the business about the poor. Clement of Alexandria, writing about the year 200, has an interesting essay on whether the rich can become Christians. At this time, the year 200, Christianity is not a legitimate religion in the empire. It's subject to some persecution. And almost entirely, Christians are members of the urban poor, the urban poor. The Latin word for someone who lives in a rural area is paganos, pagan, because that's where the old religion held out longest in the countryside. In the cities, Christianity took root, but it took root, first of all, among the poor. If you were a person of status, if you were a person of position in the empire, you really couldn't afford to be a Christian. But Clement is writing in Alexandria. It's sort of like the New York of the day, people from all over the place, port city in the north of Egypt. And they were interested in religion, and Christianity seemed intriguing to them. And he writes that this problem of whether the rich can become Christian focused on whether they would have to give up all of their wealth. Now, earlier, in the middle of the first century, the church dealt with another problem. Some of the apostles thought that if any of the Greeks were to become Christian, they would have to be circumcised. That's a really bad marketing plan, by the way. And Peter decided after consultation that that was not necessary. A second bad marketing plan is you have to give up everything that you've got if you're going to become Christian. Clement said, I think this is kind of interesting. Clement said, no, you don't. You have to be detached from it. And he said, now, if you give everything up and you spend the rest of your life lamenting the fact that you don't have that money and property, you haven't become detached. But if you keep your wealth, but are ready to use it for God's purposes whenever that comes along, you are detached. Does that make sense? Okay? So we're talking about a kind of spiritual detachment. Others, Ambrose, who was a mentor for Augustine, Chrysostom, who was the Archbishop of Constantinople for a time, Gregory the Great, Pope, all lamented the fact that that the poor were neglected by the social system of the time, and tended to say things like, if you give aid to the poor, you're not really giving out of your generosity, you're giving to them what belongs to them. So hold that thought. You know, many of you, I think, the works of mercy, the corporal works of mercy and spiritual works of mercy, including among the corporal works of mercy, almsgiving. That word, by the way, comes from the Greek word for mercy. To give alms is to be merciful. And mercy is not a matter of justice, it's a matter of love. So giving alms is merciful. Now, the next bullet point is probably unclear, but let me explain that a little bit. When I was thinking about Christian works of mercy, I was thinking about things that Christians did distinctively. Hospitals were unknown in the ancient world. They were a Christian invention in the early Middle Ages. Think about the great many of religious orders that are dedicated to a particular form of ministry, a particular form of mercy, whether it's education, healthcare, any number of things. One of the first religious orders, one of the first communities to become a recognizable order, was one you probably haven't heard of. It's called the Trinitarians. And they called themselves the Order of the Most Holy Trinity and of Captives, because their particular ministry involved ransoming captives who were captured by African pirates in the Mediterranean. So these were Muslim pirates, particularly that raided Italy and would capture Christians and sell them into slavery. Interesting ministry, isn't it? You ransom sometimes by saying, take me instead of them. That's an work of mercy. Pope Benedict, in his first encyclical, said that the work of charity is essential to the mission of the church. It's not optional, it's absolutely essential to the mission of the church. Preaching, worship, and charity. Well, let's talk for a minute about the idea of the option for the poor. I hope to have persuaded you that concern for the poor is not something new in history of the church. The option for the poor, like some other concepts, it didn't receive a formal explanation. People began speaking about the option for the poor. I've tried to trace the origin of that, and I've seen a couple of things, but I haven't actually found it. Some texts suggest that the superior general of the Jesuits at the time, Pedro Arrupe, in a letter to the Jesuit community as a whole, talked about an option for the poor. But I found letters from that period, but I haven't found one that introduces that thought. But it's possible. About the same time, the bishops of Latin America were wrestling with the economic problems in the continent and the distress of the poor in many places. And they formulated something like an option for the poor. Option here could be replaced by the word choice. But in its early formulations, it seems to have had a particular edge to it. One contemporary author writes, and you can see the quote on your handout, an option for the poor is a commitment by individual Christians in the Christian community at every level to engage actively in a struggle to overcome the social injustices that mar our world. The person who makes such an option is undertaking to work to change the unjust economic, social, and political structures that determine how power and resources are shared in the world. That is one notion of the option for the poor. Pope John Paul became Pope in 1978. It was in the decade following a lot of the work that had been done in Latin America and so on. And he was invited actually to address a meeting of the Latin American bishops in Puebla, Mexico in about 1980 or 81. And he spoke about the option for the poor. He had some reservations about the way in which it was understood. And he addressed some of those reservations, spoke about it on a number of occasions. In 1987, he finally tried to lay out his understanding of what an option for the poor would mean in the context of the tradition of the church. And he wrote, the option for the poor is a special form of primacy in the exercise of charity. We'll come back to charity in just a moment. To which the whole tradition of the church bears witness. It affects the life of each Christian inasmuch as he or she seeks to imitate the life of Christ, but applies equally to our social responsibilities and hence to our manner of living and to the logical decisions to be made concerning the ownership and use of goods. John Paul had a concern that the option for the poor, as understood in some circles, moved in a couple of directions that he thought were not consistent with the tradition of the church. One was that it tended to take as a starting point a kind of class conflict. And we understand that this is not, by the way, to say that there are not people who do evil things or people who, there are not people who exploit others and so on. But John Paul, following, well, among others, Leo XIII, who 100 years earlier had written Rerum Novarum, one of the early encyclicals on the social tradition. Leo at that time insisted that the way forward was not conflict between owners and workers, but a kind of mutual respect and mutual concern for one another. And John Paul felt the same way. So it's not for the church to be fomenting or encouraging conflict between classes. He was concerned that the ministry of the church is universal. It's concerned with everyone and excludes no one. So anything that might in some way tend to say, you're a bad person and we're not concerned about your soul, we're concerned about others. Again, this is not to deny that bad things are happening, but it's to say we're concerned about everyone. The church is universal. He also reflected on the fact that the needs of the poor are not merely material, they are hungry for God. They are hungry for God. Very quick story. Shortly after John Paul became Pope, he had to deal with some of the communist nations, including Poland, where he had lived most of his life. Well, he lived all of his life, really, except for studying. And the papal bureaucracy at the time had worked out an arrangement with communist nations that they called realpolitik, realistic politics. And the arrangement was that they would not criticize the communist nations or the communist governments, and in exchange, the communist governments would allow the church a certain level of freedom. Now, these men at the time were very much aware of what happened, for instance, in Germany and Holland and places like that during the Second World War, where if the church spoke out about what the Nazis were doing, priests and nuns and so on would be sent to concentration camps and all sorts of other things would happen. So they were aware of that. And they had the impression that John Paul was just naive on the world stage. I mean, how much could he possibly know about communism? Well, probably a little bit of experience. And they said, no, you do understand, don't you, that you have to continue this policy and you can't rock the boat. So think of it as a conservative or kind of right-wing policy. And John Paul said, oh yes, I understand every word that you're saying, and so on and so on. And he went out and ignored it entirely. And he said, the people are hungry for God. And that's what we have to give them. People are hungry for God. He was also aware, and I've got a longer quote on the second page, he was aware that we can talk about different forms of poverty. Certainly, we talk about material poverty, the lack of the material needs for a decent human life. By the way, just another little aside. Even though we say they do, I don't think religious ever take a vow of poverty. They take a vow of simplicity of life. They don't take a vow of being malnourished, ill, having no place to live, having inadequate clothing, having no heat, no Wi-Fi and internet, so on and so on. Does that make sense? It's really a vow of simplicity of life, not a vow of the suffering of poverty. So we know that poverty is, as we ordinarily think of it, is not a good thing. It's not something to aspire to. It's not something that clergy and religious aspire to. There are some concepts behind the option for the poor that are worth exploring or worth considering. The first one and the most important one is the idea of charity. Charity is often misunderstood. In the Catholic tradition, charity is a virtue. It's a supernatural virtue. It's a virtue by which we are given the gift of knowing God, not perfectly, not completely, not ever, but knowing God, and as a consequence, becoming able to love God. We cannot love what we do not know. We cannot love what we do not know. Charity is a gift that enables us to know and love God, but also to see the image of God, the image of the God that we love in the others around us. And because we can see that image of the God that we love, we are, through charity, inclined to will the good for others and to do the good for others. In Latin, coming into English, that's benevolence, the will to do the good for others, like voluntary. Bene is a Latin prefix for good. So to will the good is benevolence. To do the good is benefaction, benefactor, factory, to make things. So to do good things is benefaction. Charity prompts benevolence and benefaction. Common good. Common good is another one of these often misunderstood ideas, and we're not going to go into the whole of it tonight, but I want to mention one aspect of the common good. The common good of a society, and every community has common goods, by the way, families, parishes, corporations, even universities in some way or another have common goods. Every community has a common good. The instrumental common good, in other words, the common good that is constituted by a set of conditions, is what we usually think about in this context. The Second Vatican Council, actually copying something from Pope John the 23rd, said the common good embraces the sum of those conditions of social life whereby men, families, and associations more adequately and readily attain their own perfection. So there are a couple of things I want you to think about just for a moment. One is that the common good is a set of conditions. It's not the end game. It's a set of conditions that make something else possible. Does that make sense? It's a set of conditions. It's a set of conditions, by the way, that in a sinful world we can never perfect. We can never perfect. You can think of it as a sort of on the analogy of the game of golf. You know, I'm not much of a golfer. I play occasionally, not much of a golfer. Someone once said golf is just a good walk spoiled. But the analogy you might keep in mind is golf is a game you can play but never win. You know, a perfect game of golf would be 18 strokes. Nobody ever does that. We never, ever fully instantiate the common good. We have to work at it, we have to fix it, we have to repair it, we have to defend it, we have to sustain it, but we never make it perfect. Not in the world in which we live. Second thing is that the idea of the common good is that it liberates people and protects people to seek their own fulfillment. It's not something that we do to people or for people. I tell my students at the beginning of the semester, I cannot make you learn. I cannot make you learn. That's your responsibility. I can try to create some conditions that make it possible, but I can't make you do it. I can't. If any of you have been parents of teenagers, you know what I mean. You can't always make them do what you can't really make them do what you want. There's an old saying in the Army, we can't make you do what we tell you to do, but we can make you wish you did. Parents don't have quite that power. A third notion that lies behind this, the option for the poor, is solidarity. For John Paul, solidarity had a particular meaning, and he has kind of contributed this to the conversation. He said, solidarity is not a feeling of vague compassion or shallow distress at the misfortunes of many people. Another little story. A long time ago, I haven't seen students do this at St. Thomas for a long time, but there used to be a little practice where some students, typically in maybe October, the fall semester, would camp out in the middle of campus for a night in solidarity with the homeless. It's not wicked, it's not evil. But what they would do is choose a mild night in October, and they would set up some tents outside the student union that had the cafeteria and the bathrooms and the vending machines, and so on and so on. It's not exactly living the life of the homeless under a bridge and so on. And I did wonder, I think they were well-intentioned and good-hearted, but I wondered what actually that changed for anyone. And the fact that they chose a very comfortable time and place to do that maybe wasn't the best demonstration. It could be a kind of shallow demonstration of concern about something. And John Paul says that's not what we're really talking about. But it's a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good. That's to say, to the good of all and each individual, because we're really responsible for all. What he means by this is, as we live our lives as Christian disciples, we think about the choices we make in our lives, the purchasing choices, choices about what we do with our money, the way in which we conduct our business and our jobs, and so on and so on. How does this have an impact on the common good? Are there ways in which we can support this common good, this set of conditions that enables everyone in the community to flourish? Are there ways in which we can support that? Are there things that we do that might undermine that, and we shouldn't do those things, and so on? We can't do everything. We can't do everything, but we can do some things. When John Paul says we're all really responsible for all, what he means is there's nobody that should be left out of that calculation. We can't say we're concerned about everybody on the planet except Packers fans. We can't do that. Everybody has to be included in principle. Now, you and I can't address everybody's needs, but we can hold them in mind. The last thing, the universal destination of the goods of creation, a basic principle in Catholic social thought. God destined the earth and all it contains for all men and all people so that all created things would be shared fairly by all mankind under the guidance of justice tempered by charity. In other words, the abundance of the goods of the earth is intended for everyone's use. No one has a right to accumulate more than he needs and to hold it away from people who are in need. Thomas Aquinas, in fact, in the 13th century, wrote in response to a question, would it be theft for someone to take something essential from another person if he were desperately in need? And the answer he gave was something like this. If you've got, let's say, a garage full of bread, more than enough that you need to feed your family and so on, and someone is really hungry, would it be all right for him to take what he needed to sustain his life? And Thomas said yes. But then he added something else. He said, but it's not theft. He said, it's not theft, because if you've got all that much and you're withholding it from other people who are in need, you have no right to keep that. And it's right for them to take it. Not to take what you need, but to take your surplus if they're in great need. Does that make some sense? Okay. This last line about it should be shared fairly by all mankind under the guidance of justice tempered by charity. There we might even read a little bit better, mercy, tempered by mercy. Charity, yes. Charity is the kind of overarching virtue, but mercy is a category under that. So think about mercy in this way: giving to those who are in need even when they don't deserve it. Giving to those who are in need even when they don't deserve it. Yahweh said to the people of the Old Testament, treat the stranger, the widow, and the orphan well, because I treated you well when you were in captivity. I brought you out of Egypt. The Christian version of that is Jesus became one of us, died on the cross, and we didn't deserve that. We're the beneficiaries of his merciful love. We need to be the donors of merciful love, so to speak, to others, because that's what we've received. a couple of quick things and we'll quit for questions. One is, I've long formed the impression that the church isn't very good at numbers. If you paid any attention at all to what's going on in Vatican finances, by the way, that's evident. But the church isn't really very good at numbers. If I were to ask you, and I'm not going to, partly for the interest of time, is poverty growing or declining in the world around us? If you listen to the church documents, almost universally they'll say it's getting worse. And in point of fact, it's not. It's just the opposite. At the beginning of the 19th century, we estimate that about 90% of the people on Earth were living in what we would call severe or abject poverty. And probably this was, as far as we can tell, this was a situation through much of human history. A very small number of people had a great deal of wealth, and others had almost nothing. We estimate today that the number of people who, on the planet who are living in abject poverty is not 90%, but about 10%. We've never seen anything like that in human history. That's a huge change. Now, it doesn't mean that everyone is living like suburbanites in Los Angeles. They aren't, but they're not living at this level of abject poverty. Things have been getting better. But even 10% of the population of the globe is 700 million people. That's not a small number, but in some way, things really are getting better. John Paul, as I mentioned to you, distinguished, or at least invited us to think about the difference between material poverty and spiritual poverty, and I've got a long quote from a message that he wrote for Lent in 1998, 25 years ago. That distinguishes those. I'm not going to read that to you, but I do want to say just a couple of quick things about discernment in our own lives with respect to this notion of the option for the poor. Each of us has multiple vocations in life, some at the same time. Some of you are parents, but you also have parents living. You have jobs, you have duties there, and so on and so on. But many of us are trying to juggle a number of things all at once, and these can be genuine vocations. But we also may have vocations that are consecutive. I would like to persuade my undergraduates that their principal vocation right now is student, rather than something else, and that's temporary, and they'll move to something else later on. Because we have vocations, some of them are kind of primary for us. If you're a spouse, if you are a parent, your principal vocation is to care for your family. Not your exclusive vocation, but it's your principal vocation. And you have other duties. The kind of rule for us as Christian disciples is to be alive to the possibilities of using our gifts to help others. Just as Clement in the year 200 said, people can hold on to their wealth, but they need to be alive to ways in which they can use that wealth for God's purposes. So as we think about this, the virtue of solidarity that I mentioned to you a moment ago is a way of embodying the option for the poor. It inclines us, it determines us in a way, makes us what we are, to be mindful of the needs of others and to address those needs as our vocational duties permit and as opportunities are presented to us. That can mean something as mundane as being aware of the things that we purchase and how they come to the market, how they're made, so on and so on. It means being aware of ways in which we might be able to use some of our resources to help others, donations, almsgiving. Are there other things that we can do to help others that we might otherwise just overlook? Just helping someone on the street sometimes, or what have you. There are lots of ordinary things in the day. In fact, there are lots of ordinary things in every parish. In every parish, there are people who are lonely. There are people who are distressed. There are people who are worried or frightened, and so on and so on. They're all around us, and we need to be alive to those opportunities. That's one of the things that the option for the poor means. So thanks for your attention. If you have any questions, I think I'm done. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah. Yes, please.
In your example, when you were talking about Thomas Aquinas and how it's okay to take bread from somebody who has a lot, why is that okay? Was it preventing that person from doing what that other person did to create the bread?
Well, I'm not sure I understand the second part of the question, but let me put it this way. What Thomas said is that, okay. I'll repeat the question, and you tell me if I misunderstand it. Why would it be not theft? Why would it be morally legitimate for someone to take bread from another person who has an abundance of it? And the second part?
Well, what prevents that person from going and creating his own abundance? Why is it okay for him to steal
Okay.
if he's capable?
Well, I think Thomas would say if he's capable of creating his own bread, then he doesn't have a warrant for taking it from someone else. But the answer would be, assuming that someone has no other way of getting the bread, then it's not theft for him to take it from someone who has more than he can use. So, we could change the example and say, not bread, but what about medicine? Somebody has a hoard of medicine and other people need it and there's no other way they can get it. Would they be justified in taking the surplus from someone who had it? And Thomas would say yes, and it's not theft. John Paul had a phrase that I think Aquinas would have understood. And he said, we have to remember that all private property is under a social mortgage. That all private property is under a social mortgage. So that you have a right to your property, you have a right to hold your property, but it's a contingent right. In the face of the urgent need of others, maybe you have to let go of some of your property. A trivial example would be your next door neighbor's shed catches on fire, and he doesn't have a garden hose, but you do. Can he use your garden hose? And if your answer is, no, look, that's my garden hose, I paid for it, it's mine, I get to use it, nobody else can ever use it under any circumstances whatsoever, maybe that's not right. Maybe that's not right. So we're not denying the legitimacy of someone who works hard to acquire something, to create something, to build something up. But understand too that another basic principle, Christian principle, everything we have is a gift. Our lives, our abilities, our education, our opportunities, our resources, everything we have is a gift. God gives us these gifts, yes, for our purposes, to nurture us, but also for His purposes. And the Christian posture ought to be alive to what God's purposes are. And if we have gifts, can we use some of those gifts without abandoning our other duties? Our children don't have to starve because we're giving money away, but we have to understand that at times we need to let go of what we have. The old rule was you have to be prepared to give out of your surplus. What we tend to say today is you have to be prepared sometimes to give out of your substance in the case of great need of others. Bill.
To what degree of force could that person acquire the bread from the
Old garage.
You know, I don't think Thomas ever quite talked about that. Look, I think if it's a matter of, the question is to what degree of force could be used. If it's a matter of harming that person, I think we've crossed a line. But hopefully, what we can deal with is someone who has some respect for the common good and a willingness to surrender. You know, we have a principle that says that for a very good reason, excuse me, for a very good reason, the government can appropriate private property. But that principle also says the government has a duty to compensate the owner fairly. You don't have a right, an absolute right to hold on to it, but you have a right to compensation. And the use of force, depending upon the gravity of the need, perhaps some force would be appropriate. Typically, what Aquinas would say in contexts like that is the person who has a warrant for using force is the person who represents the civil authority in the community. So the police, government, something like that. Yes, ma'am.
We've had conversations with individuals on the topic of property and the poor, and they quote scripture, and I can't remember which gospel it's in, but I think it's one where Jesus says, "The poor will always be among you."
Right.
And they use that to dismiss, that
Yeah.
quote. There's always going to be poor. To almost kind of, I think to dismiss any obligation, to say that there could be, that there's something that we could potentially do
Thank you.
about that. And I've heard that, what Jesus may have been speaking of there was that the poor will always be among you because you're not using the resources that you have in order to bring people to share the common good. So I was just hoping that you could comment on that or how you.
Well, I think you make. Did you hear the question? This line about the poor will always be among you. Remember that particular instance is where is it Mary or Martha was using Mary had purchased some oils and so on, and the others were complaining that this money could have been given to the poor. Now, I think we have to understand, first of all, there's a context. That is not all that Jesus ever said about the poor. And you have to read this in context. And I think the context would lead us to say, he's saying, really, you're all sinful people. And the world you live in will always have sinful people. And therefore, there will always be people whose vulnerability will be exploited and who will be poor. So if you're going to wait to do good things in other areas until you've completely wiped out poverty, good luck. And so it is appropriate for Mary to do this in this context. But that's not a general statement about, and it would be perverse to say so, that it's a statement that says we shouldn't bother to try to deal with the poor because you're never going to eradicate poverty. Sir?
You read this statement about the universal destination of goods in creation in a little paragraph. How does that reconcile with immigration or with people moving? You know, we've got they drew lines where the United States is randomly. If you're on the other side of the line, you don't have things. You know, or you're not entitled to what we've got, ours.
Well, okay, that's a very complex question, and I don't think we have time tonight to get into all of it, but let me suggest that, let me give you an example from St. Augustine. Augustine said that he thought that the call it maldistribution of resources around the world was actually part of God's plan. Because if every community, every city had all of the resources it needed, there would be no particular reason for any community to deal with another community. But since the resources, some people have farmland, some people have mineral resources, some people have fish, some people have water, that this meant that in order to live better lives, people would have to deal with one another, trade with one another, help one another, and this builds a different kind of community. Now, we hold the legitimacy of private property, but it's not an absolute right. We certainly hold the legitimacy of political communities, and political communities can defend the common good of the community, but it's not an absolute right to do so.
Maybe two more.
Two more, sir.
You made a comment that the church is good with data. So I agree with that because I've seen it in play, especially like.
Except for this parish, I mean.
Yeah.
Yes.
Given our history that we've created universities and things, in your opinion, like, how did that come about that we're bad at data? We should be great at data. Because I've seen it misused in other ways.
Yeah.
A prime example is the systemic racism thing we hear in media. If you look at the actual numbers of things, you'll realize that the reasons they're saying aren't the reasons why the disparities.
Okay.
So anyway.
Yeah. I probably another complex question. The church has always had a kind of love-hate relationship with finance. So it's often both had difficulty managing finances, but also had very crafty people who can do it quite well. But at least from what I've seen in the 20th century and even going back into the 19th century, the 20th century, some call the first century where we really have data all through the century, the first numbered century where we keep track of all kinds of things. And the church is just behind the curve on that. So we often hear the church saying, and maybe it's rhetorical flourish, but we'll hear the church saying, well, poverty is just getting worse all over the world. And maybe in some places it is, but we've made tremendous improvements in the lives of people around the world. A long way to go, but we've made tremendous improvements. And I kind of, I grit my teeth when I see church documents talking about a number of things that really are expressible in numbers. We have the data, but they don't pay attention to the data. So I don't know how that happens. Universities aren't great on that either. A colleague of mine in management used to say, universities are immune to their own knowledge. We'll teach other people how to do it, but we don't take those lessons to heart. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Well, a number of years ago, I had a non-Catholic friend that went to Vatican City, and someday I want to go to Rome. I've never been there before. And he came back and he said, "There's so many valuable things at Vatican City, like beautiful works of art."
Yeah.
And he questioned the Catholic Church's, appeal to the poor, because they could, they should sell all of that and give the money to the poor. I wasn't sure how to respond to that.
Yeah.
Maybe a decade ago.
Yeah.
When someone said that.
If any of you, there was a movie made out of this back in the 60s, and it's a novel called The Shoes of the Fisherman. Okay? And that was one of the themes of the novel. How much is the Sistine Chapel ceiling worth?
There's no price tag.
Thank you. That's exactly the right answer. Look, the church is the custodian of an enormous amount of art. One of the things that I think is actually in conversation is whether the church could derive some income from licensing the reproduction of some of the art that's in the Vatican Museum. I'm not sure that the human race would be better off, Mary and Martha again, if somebody else had custody, or if a lot of this was distributed in one way or another. And there are murals and frescoes and things like that in the Vatican, and you can't actually take the wall out and sell it to someone, but there might be ways of monetizing that value that could be used for other purposes. But in one of, last comment, in one of John Paul's encyclicals, he said, you know, there may come times and places where the church really has to think about whether it should hold on to its rich furnishings and liturgical vessels and things like that. And perhaps it would be incumbent on the church to sell some of these things to relieve the poor. So the idea does get floated around. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for the evening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kennedy. Let's take a short break. Hospitality is right in this room right here. There's decaf and some cookies and things like that. The bathrooms, if you're not from St. John Newman, they're through the room next to us in the hallway. Men's and women's room are right there in the hallway. And then come back here. We're going to have a small group discussion. Dr. Kennedy shared with us some of the core issues in his talk, and we've made those core issues into questions for you to discuss. So to get up and move around and get some blood moving, maybe some decaf and some sugar.